Nintendo is known for its reputation in making great games. However, there are some doubts about the Switch 2 and if it will succeed. On top of this, there are some games Nintendo has published that have been outright embarrassing. This has made me wonder, is Nintendo falling off? I want to be clear. I'm not going into this with my mind set on yes, Nintendo is falling off, or no, Nintendo isn't. Instead, I'll be looking at Nintendo's past to analyze their shortcomings and how they overcame them, and as well as their quality in previous games compared to today. So, let's look at Nintendo's first failure, the GameCube. People have talked extensively about all the reasons as to why the GameCube failed, and they all had an impact. But the truth is that the GameCube's failure was a long time coming. Look at the trajectory of Nintendo's units sold for each console. They were on a downwards trend because people are moving to the competition throughout the years. This is due to a fundamental part of the console industry that the consumer does not directly see. Part of selling consoles requires the company to also market to game studios. So while the end user who buys the console is who the console targets, as that's where they get most of their money, in order to succeed, a console must also provide value to game devs. Nintendo did not understand this for a very long time, and they suffered because of this. When the Nintendo and Super Nintendo came out, game studios were forced to make a game on a Nintendo if they wanted their game to reach the console market. This, in turn, creates an effect where all games are on the Nintendo. Since gamers, surprise, care about playing video games, they will tend to buy the console that has the most video games that interest them. So, in order to be successful in selling a console, it must be appealing to game devs and have them make games for your console, or the console will fail as there aren't enough games for people to play. Nintendo was great at making games, which added extra value to their console and gave consumers an extra reason to buy their console. The issue was that this was Nintendo's only real value, and so third-party developers were an afterthought. This is best reflected through the relationship between Rare and Nintendo. Nintendo gave Rare a license to make games using Donkey Kong. So while Rare made their own games, they also made Donkey Kong games as well. However, while Nintendo was working on releasing the GameCube, Rare needed money, and they needed it fast. So Rare went to Nintendo and asked them to buy Rare out. Nintendo hesitated and brushed them off. The result is Rare went on to the public market and was bought out by Microsoft. While this was a mistake often pointed to one of the reasons why the GameCube failed, it also highlights how bad Nintendo is at third-party relationships. They view them as an afterthought. Sony is not great at making video games. They make hardware equipment. However, they decided to enter the console industry, and they succeeded instantly. This is because Sony is great at business. They understood the value of third-party developers, and they made their console more appealing to develop for than Nintendo's consoles. While Nintendo was taking their time with releasing the Nintendo 64, Sony made a less powerful console with more games and a cheap and easy way for developers to make games for PlayStation. PlayStation's DVDs also offered so much more space when compared to the Nintendo 64. Nintendo was never in a position where they needed to attract game devs. It was actually the opposite. Game devs needed Nintendo. So Nintendo made them pay expensive licensing fees in order to make a game for Nintendo. So when the Nintendo 64 was in development, the thought of using discs was never acted upon because Nintendo wanted to provide the best experience to the end user instead of making it easy for game devs to make games for their console. Nintendo has been in a position to expect the game devs to make games for their console, so they never thought about it. And think about it, at the end of the day, if a game is on a DVD or a cartridge, it doesn't really make a difference to the consumer. Actually, cartridges are slightly better because DVDs are really easy to damage. The Nintendo 64 was the first time game devs didn't choose Nintendo on a massive scale. Nintendo tried to emphasize the power of the Nintendo 64. if they forgot the reason why people buy consoles: to play video games. Nintendo makes their own games to give added value to their console, which makes them the most popular, or at least used to be the case until the Nintendo 64 came out. When Nintendo would be the most popular console, it would force game devs to make games on Nintendo. This strategy worked for Nintendo and the Super Nintendo, but it was starting to show its cracks once the Nintendo 64 was released. The Nintendo 64 launched with only 2 games. Sony launched with 12. At the end of the PlayStation's life, it had over 1,000 games. The Nintendo 64 only had around 300. Now, obviously an argument can be made about those 1,000 PlayStation games being lower quality, but that would be missing the point. Even if you play the best game of all time, once you beat it, now what? There needs to be another game you can play. Now, some games are replayable, but even then, people will tend to get bored eventually. People have their own preferences. A game that a person loves can be a game that is not all that interesting to another person. For example, Fire Emblem is one of my favorite game series. I love the gameplay, but to someone else, the gameplay can be seen as boring or slow. This is reflected by the sales numbers, where games struggle to break 1 million sales at times. The low sales doesn't mean the game is bad, it means that it's appealing to a small number of people. The point is that those types of games are important. While Nintendo has their own game series that appeal to a smaller number of people too, they can only make so many games. This limits their strategy of making games, which will in turn attract game devs. The PlayStation might have a ton of mid games, but some of those mid games are cherished by some. And when you have over 1,000 games, you are bound to have enough games to please everyone. When the GameCube was in development, Nintendo wanted to have their cake and eat it too. They decided to move to discs, but with a catch. They made their own proprietary disc that is different from DVDs. It's smaller in size too. The unique disc made it harder to pirate their games or make knockoff games without going through Nintendo. The issue is that Nintendo no longer provided enough value to third-party games. The result was that Nintendo was an afterthought for third-party developers. They would make a game for a GameCube if they could, but even then, Nintendo was not doing them any favors with such a small disc, which forced games to have smaller file size to its competitors. This also had a ripple effect, where the GameCube versions were the worst quality in most cases, and developers would have to cut corners somewhere to make the game fit on the disc. The result of Nintendo not properly making their console to attract the game devs resulted in GameCube providing little value to customers. Sure, there were good games, but you're missing out on all the games the competitors had. In addition, if some Nintendo games don't interest you, then you will find yourself not playing your GameCube very often. It was no surprise that the PlayStation 2 was the best-selling console of all time. They were able to provide the most value to customers, so much so that they blew the competition by a long shot. They had a DVD drive so you could watch movies, and they had a massive library of games, a total of over 4,000 games. You were bound to find enough games on the PlayStation 2 to play it for as long as you want until the next generation. The same cannot be said for the GameCube. What lesson did Nintendo learn from this? They learned the value of third-party developers. Just kidding. They actually learned that being the most powerful console no longer provided enough value to consumers. So they needed to re-innovate, and they came up with something that swept the world by storm. A console with emotion controls. The Wii was able to offer something that you could not get anywhere else. A novel idea that was easy for people to understand. Wii Sports demonstrated this perfectly, which is great because it was sold with every console. You can motion the action of a sport and it would happen on screen. The result is that Nintendo attracted a new audience of people. These people were the adults who had busy lives And while they grew up with gaming, they drifted away as they got older. Those who only ever played a video game at a friend's house who wanted a cheap console. Those who wanted to try something new. Something that worked so well that it seemed like fiction. Everyone wanted a Wii. Everyone wanted to try the new thing. The issue with gimmicks is that gimmicks get old. As cool as it is that you can now play games using motion controls, it gets old. If you like playing games for a long period of time, it wears on your arm and wrist. There were reports of people getting arthritis from playing Super Mario Galaxy. Even as a kid, my wrist would hurt from shaking it so much. When was the last time you played a Wii? Try going back to playing Super Mario Bros. Wii or Super Mario Galaxy. Having to flick your wrist to spin or shake the twirl gets annoying real fast. This is especially the case after playing both Galaxy on the Switch and Super Mario Bros. U Deluxe. Both allow you to press a button instead of shaking, and it feels so much better. This isn't to take away from the Wii. I love the Wii, but most of the time I play it for every reason except the motion controls. I play the Wii for the GameCube games, the Virtual Console games, and the Wii games. The only Wii game that benefits from motion controls, in my opinion, is Metroid Prime. But that is because the alternative is tank controls with a GameCube controller, and I'm not putting up with that. But anyways, Nintendo was able to have a resurgence by attracting a new and old audience through a gimmick, and kept being Nintendo in the process to provide value through its games. It had the best library of games to date. You could play NES games, SNES games, N64 games, GameCube games, and Wii games, and even Sega games. The Wii provides amazing value on top of providing value in a unique way to draw people in. Nintendo did switch to DVDs, so they did learn something from the GameCube's failure, so it made it easy for devs to develop for the Wii despite its motion controls. Though, due to being a gimmick console, the major third-party games coming out were not coming out on Wii. And since gimmicks don't last, Nintendo took an even harder hit than the GameCube's failure. The Wii was really a band-aid to the main issue, which is that Nintendo can't attract third-party developers. While the GameCube's failure was more predictable due to the downward trend of Nintendo during that time, the flop of the Wii U was a sharp contrast compared to the Wii. Again, people had all their reasons as to why the Wii U failed, and they're all right. But all its issues stem from two major issues. One, the Wii U has a terrible gimmick, and two, the Wii U has no third-party games, no Call of Duty. When it finally got Minecraft, it was even a worse version than the PS4 version and the Xbox One version. PlayStation 4 and Xbox One got all the cool stuff. Then there was the Wii U. It was the GameCube all over again. Nintendo learned a different lesson this time. The lesson of trying to appeal to gamers through gimmicks, which is that it will never last. It's only temporary. I have not spent much time talking about Nintendo's handhelds. While the GameCube was flopping, the Game Boy Advance sold 81 million units. Nintendo's always been great at making handhelds. This is because, unlike the console industry, where Nintendo was no longer having devs beg to make games on their console, for the Game Boy Advance, they were. Nintendo has always dominated the handheld space. No one can do it better than them. This is until the iPhone became more and more popular. Now, developers weren't forced to only make games for Nintendo handhelds. Now, they can make games for iPhones as well. And when the Wii U was out, both their handheld and console was doing terribly. Nintendo was put in a position they have never been in the past. Nintendo has completely fallen off. They needed to do something, and they needed to do something fast. They came up with one of the best decisions Nintendo has made, the Nintendo Switch, merging their console with their handheld. At first, this might seem bad. They're selling less hardware than before. However, this is not bad due to how consoles make money. Consoles don't make money by selling units. Consoles make money the same way Steam makes money, by selling games. Just like Steam is a platform for buying games on PC, Nintendo, Microsoft, and PlayStation's games are all a platform for people to buy games. Typically, consoles take a 30% cut, just like Steam. So what this means is it doesn't matter if Nintendo has 2 consoles or 1. What matters is how many games they sell. By merging their console audience with their handheld audience, which usually has a lot of overlap anyway, they're able to have all their games in one place. Nintendo has finally been able to make a console that provides value to the user while also providing plenty of games to the end user. This is best reflected through how lenient Nintendo's become with indie developers. In the past, Nintendo would not take game devs seriously if they did not have an office. Now, Nintendo lets almost anyone publish games on the Nintendo Switch, since they end up making money from it anyways. On top of the Switch's unique trait of being able to be played on a TV and on the go, the other major selling point to buy a Switch over other consoles is the first-party Nintendo games. Now, in the beginning of the video I mentioned the decline in quality of the games. What games are these? The biggest embarrassment is Switch Sports. Had no content and was a complete cash grab. Mario Golf is another example, and I feel bad for anyone who bought it. Mario Strikers is another example that is also a game that's disappointing. A big reason for this is due to the price. Notice how these games are sports games? Sports games are hard to make because it's hard to make one that provides value. There's a reason why sports games sell for very little on secondary markets. Nintendo is no exception to this. Nintendo tries to charge $60 for Mario Strikers, and if you check on eBay, you can easily get one for $30. Another great example of this is Mario and Sonic Olympic Games 2020, which can be found on eBay for $25. On Switch, it still costs $60. The reality is that Nintendo is overpricing some of their games, but they're not the only ones. Games that are tied to cartridges tend to sell at the same price digitally, which hurts the games that are overpriced since they can't sell at a price that they should be sold at due to the cost of making a physical game. The reality is that Nintendo has always had misses. For example, Wii Music was an embarrassing game, and while some people liked it, it was not very good. Sticker Star was also a widely hated game. On the GameCube there was Star Fox Zero, which was completely different from what a typical Star Fox game would even be. Even when Nintendo had made better sports games, they usually don't sell as well as their other games. It is in my opinion that Nintendo's next big innovation will be moving away from physical games, at least for their lower quality games. By lower quality, I don't mean bad games. I just mean games that don't have any reason to cost even $50. For example, Mario Party, sports games, games like 1-2 Switch. These types of games should cost around $20 to $30, and I guarantee Nintendo would make more money if they did. These types of games should cost around $20 to $30, and I guarantee Nintendo would make more money from these games if they did. And this isn't to say that these games are bad, it's just that they're not worth as much as the next big Mario game. That brings us to the Switch 2. Will Nintendo repeat history? No. In fact, the Switch 2, or whatever it's called, was delayed for a year so it can secure third-party games and have a good lineup. This shows that Nintendo has learned from its past mistakes and understands the value that consoles provide, which is video games. That's where it starts and that's where it ends. All the other things are nice, but if there are no games to play, then all the extra stuff doesn't matter. Since Nintendo's value is coming less and less attached to their games that they make, Nintendo could become complacent with the quality of their games. Right now, they are able to charge super high prices due to their quality, and those prices usually stay that way on secondary markets. However, they are beginning to release games that are selling half as much on secondary markets. This can become a major problem for Nintendo in the future. If Nintendo was ever known for making bad games, it would kill their console sales. This is why it is very important for Nintendo to try and make the best games possible. This is why it is very important for Nintendo to not only make good games, but to innovate. Although, even though this is worrying for Nintendo's future, this isn't Nintendo's future right now. Right now, Nintendo is still continuing to make great games. Will the Switch 2 outsell the Switch in units? It's possible. It really depends on a few factors. The biggest is, what games will it have? Will it have the big games like Call of Duty? It's possible since Microsoft bought Activision. And it also depends on the console market as a whole. How many console gamers will transition to the PC market instead? Will the console market be growing or shrinking? And is there still room for people to own both a console and a PC? Will Nintendo gain market share by Microsoft and Sony messing up and doing a terrible job with their consoles? Only time will tell. But Nintendo's next biggest hurdle, in my opinion, will be the PC market, as it is only growing, and it will be up to Nintendo to find a way to figure out what actually makes a console valuable and separate it from PCs. Or, if there isn't a world where console provides value, maybe Nintendo will shift to just producing video games. One thing's for sure is that Nintendo is unique for always innovating. They take risks when the rest of the industry takes it safe. And part of taking risks is failures. With every failure Nintendo makes, they have a game that's really popular, successful, and loved. And it is through taking risks that leads to longevity. Nintendo has always had a history of innovating since 1889 when they started making Hanafune cards. So the one thing I am confident about is that Nintendo will continue to still be willing to change and adapt and take risks. And I don't think I'll really be able to guess what they're going to do next. So the answer to the question in the beginning of the video, did Nintendo fall off? No, quite the opposite. This is mainly due to Nintendo's value coming from third-party games. But it's through this that Nintendo's actually become better than ever. And Nintendo still continues to release games that target a more niche audience that are loved by many who play it. For example, Metroid Dread. That sold 3 million units, the best a Metroid game has sold, but it's still a niche game. But for those who played it, they loved it. I have more videos like this planned. Subscribe so you see more. Thanks.